Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
The National Seashore had never been created. And this goes for a lot of other places, national seashores, national recreation areas that followed Cape Cod. We would be all the poorer for it. These are places that quite possibly express some of the highest aspirations we have in American society for the kind of society we would like to be. So I think it's important to understand their history.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 60, where summer whispers sweet nothings into our ear. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Ethan Carr about his book, The Greatest Beach, A History of Cape Cod National Seashore. Ethan Carr is a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the director of the MLA program. He is a landscape historian and preservationist specializing in public landscapes, particularly municipal national park planning and design. He's written 2 award-winning books, Wilderness by Design and Mission 66, Modernism and the National Park Dilemma, that describe the 20th century history of planning and design in the U.S. national park system as the context for considering its future management. His career in the fields of landscape architecture and historic preservation began in the professional world, where he worked for New York City Parks and the National Park Service, where he was the lead historical landscape architect at the Denver Service Center. He also worked for nonprofit organizations and private design offices and has taught at the Harvard GSD, University of Virginia, and at the University of Massachusetts. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, well, hello everyone and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I'm your host, John Monaster. I am super excited today to be speaking with author Ethan Carr about his book, The Greatest Beach, A History of Cape Cod National Seashore. Hello, Ethan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. I'm so glad to have met you and be now holding this hefty book here because it's a great one. It's a beautiful book and includes lots of interesting photos and it is pretty detailed. And so I'll let you just kick it off. Maybe if you could just give us a quick overview of, in your mind, like what is the book all about? Where are the readers going to go on this journey?
Right. Well, it's a history of Cape Cod National Seashore, and people should understand that's not an ecological history necessarily or a social history. It's actually a history of land conservation on Cape Cod and especially on the outer Cape, which is the outer portion, the 6 towns that make the bended arm out into the Atlantic Ocean. And so it's an administrative history, really, of legislation, of policies and management. And I always hasten to add that that's not as boring as it sounds. There's all sorts of things in an administrative history of Cape Cod, including nudity and natural disasters, the Kennedy family.
Right.
So it's a dramatic story, but it's the story of the park itself. I don't attempt to summarize the ecology of the Outer Cape. Other people have done that. There is a certain amount of social history, of course, because the park has from the beginning been a partnership between the federal government, that is the National Park Service, the local governments, the 6 towns of the Outer Capes, and all the residents, the people of the Outer Cape, who made this whole experiment in land conservation work in the late 50s and early 60s and afterwards to the present day.
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was quite fascinating, actually, but I am also a policy nerd by trade. So, but yeah, I think, just to kick things off, I'm always really curious about the creative side and the putting the book together side. So let's talk a little about that before we hop into the book. But just to kind of get started, I mean, there's a lot out there in terms of national parks and what's going on all over in terms of conservation. So why did you decide to focus on Cape Cod and write a book about Cape Cod? How did you get interested in it? Was there anything personally that really set you off?
Well, I've been a park historian my whole career, starting in Central Park long ago. And I've worked in the field of landscape architecture and in art history or just history on the history of American parks in particular. My previous books have been about the national park system, especially planning and design in the national park system. Then I came to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst as a faculty member. And the University of Massachusetts has a long-standing relationship with Cape Cod National Seashore, going back to the 70s when they sent a lot of scientists there, which was actually a very important sort of step in the whole development of the seashore.
Mm-hmm.
But also with a fellow faculty member here at UMass, we got graduate students involved, planning and landscape architecture students in a landscape character study.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a while ago, but it continued this relationship, this partnership of academics and the National Park Service at the National Seashore. And what I discovered is it's a unique park. The National Park Service really dates or categorizes national parks before Cape Cod and after Cape Cod. The legislation in 1961 was a turning point, and parks after that were made differently and from parks before that. And so it's a bigger story than just Cape Cod. In other words, it's not it is a local story preeminently. It's about the people who lived there and the influence they had over that legislation and over the subsequent management of the park. But it's a local story with national implications because the park system and how we do land conservation in the United States changed after 1961 based on the experience of what came to be known as the Cape Cod formula or the Cape Cod model. And so it's an interesting story for me on a national level and a park history level, not just in terms of being a local history. Although, again, it is that. I get into the weeds of local history and who was against what and which eminent people owned property within the boundaries of the proposed seashore, et cetera. So it's very much of a local story, but it's one that really changed how we did land conservation to the present day.
Yeah, definitely. And to talk through that local story, you really got into the weeds. I mean, like you were mentioning, nudists, off-road vehicles, every single issue that happened, seemingly you thought through and tried to find out more and kind of established a history here. So it's really meticulously detailed. How did you go about actually putting the book together? Once you decided, okay, this is what I wanted to focus on for my next project, how did you do the research and organization of all the different facts and ideas and think about how best to put the book together?
Well, I should mention that the book is really a partnership because the National Park Service, particularly a guy named Bill Burke, who's the park historian, and me and the University of Massachusetts, and the Library of American Landscape History, which is the nonprofit organization here in Amherst that publishes books like this. So it was a partnership effort to bring together a book like that. It has nice production values. It has lots of illustrations. And I needed to interview park staff, past and present. I needed to bring together an enormous amount of material through the federal archives. The regional office is in Waltham, Massachusetts. And so all of that had to be brought together in an effort. It took, years to do all of this. And so the real task was to not only get into all of the details and all of the information that was available, but to figure out how to use it. I mean, this is a park that has been studied. There are legislative histories, there are books that are written by the people who participated in the legislative campaign, and there are massive amount of records. Any federal agency has massive amounts of records. Mm-hmm. And in this case, and they're usually kept by the National Archives. And so the biggest task in a way was to sort through all of the material that was already available, both archival and secondary sources, and to figure out how this can be crafted into a story that has the important message that we all wanted to tell about the significance of this national park. And that, I think, was the draw for me, and it was also the great challenge, is figuring out how to tell a story that's so intensely local without ever losing sight of why it's a significant story for a much larger readership. I mean, the goal here is not to make this a book that's just significant to people who live on the Outer Cape. It's to make it significant to anyone who's interested in parks in the United States, national parks, but also state parks, local parks, the whole idea of what parks mean in American society, and how this was an important turning point in that whole larger history. So it was a challenge, is the answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I think that it's interesting to hear about how much of a challenge it is, but also how important it was to tell this story. And so maybe for people that aren't as familiar with Cape Cod, I found a sentence that I really liked that you wrote. You said, "To a greater degree possibly than any other tourist destination in the country, the appeal of Cape Cod combined people and place, cultural history, and natural beauty." So maybe just describe Cape Cod and how it was able to accomplish all of those things and be this kind of awesome destination for people.
Yeah, and so the book sort of took three parts. The first was before the Cape Cod National Seashore, all of the early land conservation efforts on the Cape. And then there's the legislative and sort of establishment history of the park, and then the subsequent management of it, especially in the 70s and 80s, but up to the present day. And what you're really asking is about the first part there, and the really essential question the book addresses throughout, which is, what is the character of the landscape of the Outer Cape of Cape Cod? And what do we mean when we say that? What have different groups and individuals meant when they talk about how important it is? I think it's universally valued, but there's no universal conclusion about what exactly it is. And so I had to really delve into that question. And that meant looking at the early tourism at Cape Cod, and especially at Henry David Thoreau, who in the late 1840s started going to Cape Cod as what we can recognize, I think, as a modern tourist, as someone like us who's looking at it in terms of, the romantic scene of the Great Beach, the sublime landscape scenery, all of the picturesque characters that he meets, the oystermen of Wellfleet and the scavengers on the beach and so on, as well as all the other sort of more ecologically oriented observations about plants and soils and trees. He's very interested in Cape Cod, in other words, as a cultural landscape. It's people and places. And at that time, no one was going to Cape Cod, especially the Outer Cape. It was not an early tourist destination in that sense. Other seaside places in New England were, but Cape Cod sort of remained out there in isolation. And it was because of the geography. It was because the train to Sandwich didn't get completed until 1847, which of course was the year before Thoreau went, because he took the train. And that's another key sort of sign that this is a different kind of visitor. So it persisted in this kind of rural isolation. And you have an entire population, although it was a dwindling population in an economically depressed area, who remembered or were the remnants of sort of life on what we now think of as old Cape Cod. Mm-hmm. Fishermen, watermen of various types, very little agriculture. The soils were so poor. But that was part of the scene, and as well as the architecture, the windmills, the stunning landscape itself, the villages like Wellfleet and Provincetown. All of these things combine together when someone like Thoreau is looking at it and writing about it. And he wrote a great book, Cape Cod, that was published in 1865 after he was dead. But and all of that is the origins of what we think of as the character of Cape Cod. And it was different from other tourist destinations that didn't have the depth of the history and also the persistence of older ways of life and architecture that Cape Cod had, because it was economically depressed, because it hadn't become a tourist destination. So you had, for example, the Cape Cod houses, which were mostly 18th century, very characteristic cottages that became the prototype for the 20th century Cape Cod house that we think of in subdivisions all over the country. You had the windmills, you had the old fishing ports, and you had, above all, the characters, the old salts, so to speak. And all of that is what Thoreau is describing. And it's not till much later in the 19th century that you even begin to see significant tourism. By the 1890s, there is significant tourism on Cape Cod, mostly on the Upper Cape, on the South Shore facing Nantucket Sound. But by that time, this whole idea of the appeal of Cape Cod was established, and it sort of grew through once people had automobiles, of course. And that's how I got the title, The Greatest Beach, because the Great Beach, which is just the outer beach of Cape Cod, the 40-mile stretch of Ocean Beach, became, I say, the greatest beach once people had cars, because massive numbers of people started to pour in after World War I. There's a whole real estate boom. The Depression slows it down but does not stop it. And you reach sort of a high point, I think, in the 1930s of what we can call the construction of the character of Cape Cod. It's a vacation mecca. It's people have vacation homes and all of that. But it's not just the ocean and the ecosystems, the natural resources, so to speak. It's also all of the history, all of the associations, all of the characters, the architecture, and the whole way of life, as the legislation would put it in 1961, of Cape Cod and especially of the Outer Cape. And so you have a situation where it's a unique situation where this entire sort of what I would describe as a cultural landscape is recognized very early on as the thing of value that people want to keep. The thing, and not just preservationists, but the Chamber of Commerce, businessmen, all recognize that there's something unique here. There's a character that's the basis of their real estate boom and of the vacation tourist economy, et cetera. And that all gets enshrined in the late 50s when the Park Service and others are drafting legislation. The legislation is about preserving the way of life on the Outer Cape. It doesn't say, oh, this is a magnificent natural area, no one should ever touch it. It says there's a unique way of life here, and there is a cultural land. It doesn't use the phrase cultural landscape, but that's what it's describing. There's a cultural landscape here, and that's what we want to preserve, the people as well as the places.
Yeah.
And that's interesting to me because, of course, that's where we are now. That's very much where land conservation is now in the United States. We think of, and all over the world for that matter. We work with people, indigenous people, whatever local people there are in landscape conservation. We don't work against them. And in a sense, this begins, at least in the United States, with Cape Cod National Seashore.
Yeah, and just to kind of take everything about Cape Cod and the cultural landscape there and connect it to the National Park Service. So I know you've done a lot of work and research into that. So maybe talk about the Park Service and the National Park System, how it came about, and how eventually it sort of became the agency that was going to be then working to make this happen.
Right, and the Park Service, of course, is created in 1916, and that's really when the national parks become a national park system administered out of Washington. Yellowstone and other early parks, Yellowstone is 1872, so a lot of people would use that date. But the modern park system is another sort of artifact of automobile tourism, because once people have cars, they're visiting all these places. And in order to prevent total chaos and destruction, which is really what was happening, they create the National Park Service in order to administer this very large park system, not unlike a park system in a city or a state, but at a national level. And up until really through the Depression and through the New Deal, which was a golden era for the Park Service because it got so much money and so many new parks were created, you had an old model of how they were thinking about national parks, which you see at Shenandoah, or you see, for that matter, earlier at Yellowstone and places like that, which was, we're going to create a great natural reservation, and anyone who's there, we're going to either get rid of them, which occurred, or buy them out and get rid of them, which occurred at a place like Shenandoah, and then we will have what we want, a national park, to a greater or less degree, a wilderness area. And then we will put in a certain amount of roads and campgrounds and public facilities so people can enjoy it without destroying it. And that was the model of the national park. That's how they did business, right through the 30s, up to the Second World War, really, with some exceptions, of course. But by the time you get to the 1950s, at a place like Cape Cod, they had reached a tough point because they wanted to create national seashores. Now, is a national seashore a national park? My answer is certainly yes. Every unit, as they say, of the national park system is a national park. But they have obviously different characteristics, different size, different issues in their management. But in the post-war period, it became really clear if some seaside reservations weren't created, there wasn't going to be any public seashore anymore, at least in many cases, because so much private development was occurring. And Cape Hatteras in North Carolina was the first example. Cape Cod was actually the second example, but the first of a new type. Cape Hatteras was sort of a turning point when the Park Service realized they really couldn't do business that way anymore. And when they got to their second big seashore project at Cape Cod, they knew they had to think of a new way of doing landscape conservation on seashores if they were going to succeed. And so the Cape Cod National Seashore, through the influence of locals, people of the Outer Cape, and through the influence of the congressional delegation from Massachusetts, who we should talk about, there's some very interesting people there, like Senator John F. Kennedy,
Right.
Really helped the Park Service make a huge change in how it did business. And for want of a better way of putting it, they said, okay, the people can stay.
Yeah.
So you have inholdings at Cape Cod National Seashore. They're called improved properties. They are residences that existed before, and they're defined as any residence with title vested before 1959, which is when the legislation is being introduced in the Senate. And this was a big change for the Park Service. They never made parks this way because inholdings were always a problem. If you had inholdings, who knows what private owners would do with them, and then therefore really create a deleterious effect on the whole national park.
Right.
So the deal was, we'll leave you in there if your towns all create overlay districts, zoning districts for within the boundaries. The 6 towns all had to create new zoning regulations, in other words, for the areas within the boundaries of the National Seashore. And those zoning regulations would prevent them from doing anything with their property other than what they were doing at the time. So they needed to stay as a residence, they needed to stay a certain size, and that would protect the national park from any encroachment or other bad effects that normally would come from having inholdings, as the Park Service would say. And that was the essence of it. That was the Cape Cod model. We're going to draw the boundaries of this huge national park, but we're not going to acquire all the private property. For anyone who's there now, we're going to leave you there in your residence as long as the towns impose zoning that we feel will protect the integrity of the park in the future. And so that was the breakthrough.
Yeah.
Because, and that was engineered, by the way, not by the Park Service. The Park Service wasn't used to doing business that way and wasn't that interested in doing business that way. It was engineered by the congressional delegation, which the senators who introduced the legislation were John Kennedy and Leverett Saltonstall, Democrat and Republican, respectively. They were very interesting people. They came from very different backgrounds. And they had a unique collaborative relationship at this time. And it was their legislative staff that came up with the legislation in 1961. And if they hadn't come in and done that, they never would have gotten that legislation passed, because so many of people who were within the boundaries of the proposed national park were very influential people. They were cultural figures, they were politicians. There were, and also locally important people who simply would have prevented the legislation from going forward, because to successfully put national park legislation through, you really need to have the congressional delegation on board. And that means the representative of the 9th District of Massachusetts, who after 1958 was a man named Hastings Keith, and it meant Leverett Saltonstall and John Kennedy. If they didn't back proposed legislation, it was very unlikely that Congress would pass it. And and they did after 1959 because of that compromise. And you see a whole change. The opposition to the park was very strong before that compromise was devised. The Park Service certainly went along with it. They were, they knew it was the only way they were going to get a national park there. And the whole second half of the book is really about the degree to which that compromise, the Cape Cod model, worked or didn't work.
Yeah, one of the other things that I thought was very interesting beyond the sort of property issues was the balance between the idea of preservation and recreation, and kind of that dilemma I think that Newton Drury talked about in terms of how do we balance that out, right? How do we make sure, say, that birds are protected while allowing for hunters, which is very important to the
Right.
cultural landscape. So how did that portion of everything play out during the run-up to the passage of the legislation?
Yeah. Uh, Besides leaving inholders in, the legislation also created a citizens advisory group, the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission. And that was unique and a precedent as well. So you had representatives from all the 6 towns and state appointed officials and federal appointed officials serving on an advisory commission of the Park Service. Another thing they didn't like, but that really helped the subsequent development of policies and management in the park. And that advisory commission, because it represented the interests of a lot of property owners and residents, as opposed to the interests, let's say, of day tripping tourists who are coming from Boston, New York, or wherever they were coming from to spend the day, became very early on very oriented to preservation versus recreation, as they put it at the time. So they didn't want marinas. They didn't want campgrounds. They didn't want a lot of services that would have been for day trippers, but not necessarily for permanent residents or for people who own vacation homes. So that was a really important factor in how the park subsequently was developed. Interestingly, it happens at a time, and this is the late 60s now, let's say, the second half of the 60s, when the environmental movement is just getting underway and picking up steam. And by 1970, you see a real shift at the National Park Service toward what they called resource management, which meant paying a lot more attention to ecological science and making decisions that were based on whether those nesting birds were protected or not, for example. And so you have a convergence of interest there between the advisory commission and the sort of the new policies of the Park Service under Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall. Conrad Worth, who had been the person behind all of this, one of the longest serving directors of the Park Service, steps down. He's replaced by George Hartzog, who's more in line with what Stuart Udall's trying to do. And so there's a real change in the agency that takes place at this point too, which is why this is also interesting. It's not just the change in let's say, legislation for land conservation. There's a change in how the Park Service is doing business and what their priorities are going to be. And as a result, you do see a lot of scientific programs for monitoring and research that are established very early in the 70s and are continuing today. You do see a lot of what we would call resource or science-based decision making. And there's controversy because especially with off-road vehicles, ORVs, who are going to start to be limited by the 80s and 90s as to where they can go in order to protect first the least turn and then the piping plover. There's going to be other controversies that have to do with the conflicting priorities between people who are interested in recreation and the Park Service with its backing from its advisory commission, who's interested in preserving resources. Nudity, for example, which took off in Brush Hollow, which is a section of Truro, the outer beach in Truro, in the 1970s, early 70s, it was eventually banned in the park. Not because people were against nudity. They were doing resource damage, right?
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden you have, several thousand people assembling in a park that the master plan called for being a natural area. So there were no services. So the choice the Park Service had was to take what was being set aside essentially as wilderness or a natural area and develop it with parking lots and bathrooms and and lifeguards and everything else. Or they could find another way to deal with the situation, which was the way they chose: we'll ban nudity in the park. By the way, they had the total support of the Advisory Commission, who also wanted to sort of keep things under a certain level of craziness,
Yeah.
and the total support of the residents of Truro. The property owners in Truro were demanding action because it was their bluffs that were being ruined, their property was being trespassed upon, et cetera. So the whole issue of nudity, which was hugely controversial, was framed around resource protection, this preservation versus recreation question. And they were challenged in court and they won, and it's held up under appeal. And that's a pretty good example of how the Park Service has done this balancing act. Also, often it's been controversial, often it's been challenged in the courts, but they have a pretty good record at Cape Cod of making choices that were subsequently upheld in the courts, and also seem to be a little bit anticipating future trends. For example, restricting off-road vehicles. Well, off-road vehicles sort of got less and less popular anyway. Restricting nudity. Well, something happens around 1976 or so, and people are just a little less anxious to have massive naked events on Cape Cod. I don't know what it was, but people calmed down a little. The times were changing. And so and no camping also, no federal campgrounds were built. There were a lot of people who wanted federal campgrounds. Well, but they seem to have anticipated what I would describe as the trends in recreation, and also anticipated legal challenges successfully. And in the end, it does seem like they've usually been on sort of the right side of these very difficult issues, while always trying to find the compromise, trying to find the middle route. With nudity, it wasn't so much a compromise, admittedly. They just banned it.
They just said no more.
ORVs, there are still places you can drive ORVs. They're limited. With other issues like that, it's usually some kind of a compromise that gets attacked by both sides, right? That's
how it works.
The other problem. With the ORVs, they were being sued by both sides, the property rights advocates and the environmentalists. So they must be doing something right.
Yeah. So we talked about getting the bill passed, how momentous that was, how it really had to get pushed by the congressional delegations. So were there any compromises made in the bill itself? Do you feel like that the bill had any problems or issues that then played out down the line?
Well, the whole bill was a compromise as far as the Park Service was concerned.
Yeah.
It left in-holders in place. It created a citizen advisory commission, but the Park Service was willing to go along with it because it also set another precedent, which it was the first time the federal government appropriated funds for the creation of a new national park. Now, the federal government had acquired land before, obviously, and some of that land had eventually become parkland. But the idea of establishing a new unit of the national park system using federal funds for land acquisition was something of a taboo in Congress until 1961. So the Park Service had their eye on a bigger prize also. They had a whole raft of national seashores and national recreation areas they wanted to create. Most of them had been planned earlier, had been frustrated in terms of legislation for many years. And so they saw this as an opportunity to set this precedent. We'll go along with these compromises, but Congress has to go along with us and commit millions and millions of dollars for land acquisition in order to create all these new kinds of national parks in areas that were heavily populated often and that had very influential constituencies. We have to compromise, we have to have inholdings, we have to have advisory commissions. And that's how park making proceeded after that. That's how land conservation by the National Park Service, at least, was going to be practiced after that. There weren't going to be a lot of situations where you could just say, well, here's 1 million acres of wilderness, make it a national park. More often, you're talking about historic sites or heavily inhabited areas that have all sorts of important historic and natural resources, but you're going to have to work with those communities, and you're going to have to work with that congressional delegation in order to get any kind of protection at the federal level.
Well, and so after this bill got passed, that barely got us halfway through the book. I mean, what did Robert Gibbs and his staff have to do to really get that National Seashore launched?
Yeah, so and you're right. I mean, the whole first half of the book, I'm just talking about sort of early land conservation on Cape Cod, the legislative campaign and how important that was. The second half of the book is about, okay, now what? It's really only the beginning, 1961, because
Right.
the legislation only authorizes the thing. All that land has to be acquired, and then they have to build any facilities, establish any policies, et cetera, for the park. And so it's a long book. No, it's not
Hmm.
that long, and it's very readable.
A lot of great
but
photos.
but
Yeah.
but what they needed to do, first of all, was create a master plan. That's always what they do. They create one in 1963. They created another one in 1970. They created another one in 1998. And all of these are real turning points. The first one was really about physical development. So they had to build a visitor center. They had to build bathhouses at the federal beaches. They had to build interpretive kiosks and waysides and parking lots and infrastructure. And they were greatly aided in this during this period. This is the early 60s by something called Mission 66, which was the Park Service program to modernize and expand the park system between 1956 and 1966.
Hmm.
Right in there with the interstate highway system, which in some ways was a response to, because all these places were going to be incredibly accessible by car once the interstate highway system was created, and right in there with mid-century modernist architecture. So you see this really interesting sort of complete set of park development plans being implemented right in there in the early 60s. It's an in-house project for the Park Service, in-house architects and landscape architects, and they build some really characteristic buildings, all according to an architectural theme that they developed right away by
Hmm.
building a couple of octagonal interpretive kiosks, really. They're shelters at Marconi Beach and Pilgrim Heights. And that in doing that, this very characteristic octagonal shingled roof shape, they established the beginnings of an architectural theme that then went into the Salt Pond Visitor Center. And by the way, they did consult with the big architectural names of the day. There were a lot of architects then and now who have houses on Cape Cod.
Mm.
And so they enlisted a lot of these people and said, what do you think? What should we do as far as architectural theme, architectural design at all for this new national park? And people like Walter Gropius and others are responding and giving them advice, which was a smart thing to do, because with that many critics in your backyard, you didn't want to start designing buildings that Walter Gropius didn't like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Mission 66 was also characterized by modernist architecture generally. It was mid-century modernism. It was that era. And they had shifted already from doing sort of rustic log and stone construction to taking advantage of new materials and new ways of thinking about architecture for a new type of building that they invented, really, which was called the Visitor Center. We didn't have visitor centers before Mission 66. Maybe we did, but we called them something else. But the Visitor Center became a new building type. And the whole building type is linked to modernist planning and architectural design ideas. The whole idea, and so that's what Salt Pond really is. Salt Pond, by the way, is now listed in the National Register of Historic Places because it's recognized as a really significant work of architecture of the mid 20th century and of the Mission 66 program.
Mm.
And you know, like anything, the new buildings when they first went up, they got a lot of flack. People were a little upset with the octagonal roofs. They thought this was not traditional Cape Cod architecture. But Mission 66 had abandoned the idea of doing traditional historical styles. They wanted to do modern architecture using traditional materials and massing. And that was exactly what Walter Gropius told them to do. Now, they had already been doing it for over 10 years, really 20 years before Walter Gropius gave them that advice. Walter Gropius had no idea what the Park Service was doing at all these other parks like Dinosaur National Monument, Rocky Mountain, all these incredible modern visitor centers that the Park Service had been building all along. But it was just as well to have Walter Gropius's seal of approval on this way of thinking about park architecture. And so they proceeded. And it still exists, most of it today. Of course, they found out about erosion and just how violent erosion on the Cape can be when for example, the Coast Guard beach bathhouse was washed away in 1978. poignantly, the very first structure they built, the Marconi Overlook Shelter, had to be removed in 2013 for the same reasons. Cape Cod is a very mobile landscape, something they didn't fully realize in the 60s when they were planning and designing the facilities, but by the early 70s they were fully aware of, especially in a couple of big storms in the 70s, culminating in 78. The Great Blizzard of 1978 made it real clear that they were going to have to work with the shoreline. They couldn't just put things where they wanted to.
Yeah. And one of the things that the book talks a lot about is the idea of impact. And, there were, like you said, there were all these studies done from all sides, from government, commissioned by private consultants, to really think about, okay, like what's going to happen here, in terms of the cities, the people, nature, living, non-living portions of that nature. So I just wanted to think about this broadly. I mean, how do you measure impact? How do you talk about impact with something that's so complex like this? How do the various people doing all the different studies you talked about in the book, approach this problem?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the word impact itself is something that's coming out of the early 70s. The environmental legislation of the early 70s, the entire sort of, and all of the creation of new parks and seashores and national recreation areas in the early 70s. The whole idea of environmental impacts is something that comes out of 1969 National Environmental Policy Act, which was the environmental impact statement. And so all of this is coming to a head right when the Cape Cod management policies are being formulated. So, okay, we've built this stuff. We've got visitor centers and bathhouses. And right away, they start a new master plan in 1970. And the 1970 master planners at the Park Service are talking about impacts. They're talking about what today we would call carrying capacity. They didn't call it that. They call it the design load, saying how many people do we really want out here? And how would you restrict them? And it's really interesting because at Cape Cod, of course, you've got a natural design load, if you like, or carrying capacity. You've got two bridges over the canal, and then you've got Route 6 going out to the Outer Cape from the Orleans Rotary. And and if you've ever been there on a holiday weekend, there is a limit to the number of cars that will fit on these roads. And so there is a natural carrying capacity, which the planners recognized and weren't unhappy with necessarily. The amount of parking at the federal beaches has been pretty much consistent since the 1970 master plan. And the visitor numbers have been pretty much consistent since the mid-70s, 4 to 5 million visitors a year. Original predictions were that there might be as many as 10 million. But it stayed at more or less 4 or 5 million. And this idea of a design load was actually predicted to some degree by the master planners in 1970, and it was very important to the subsequent management of the park. As I mentioned before, also the fact that you have Citizens Advisory Commission and local residents in favor of pushing the balance over towards preservation was really important. The Park Service agreed by the mid-70s because they had really shifted their own policies to be much more in tune with the environmental movement. And so you really see the balance shifting that way. Now, of course, the subject that came up repeatedly was, what about the way of life? What about the character of the Outer Cape? If we don't have any more ORVs or hunting or nudity or any of the other things that people were used to having on the Outer Cape, have you lost the way of life? It really comes to a head with the dune shacks in Provincetown, which the Park Service looked at as, these are the artists' shacks out on the dunes in Provincetown and Truro that originally all sorts of artists had lived in, even though they didn't really have title to the land. These were sort of constructed beach shacks, and they were a beloved tradition and the site of a real ongoing artistic tradition, especially in Provincetown. So the Park Service looks at this and says, well, we want to restore the natural scene. We're all environmentalists now. Let's demolish them as soon as we can. And the owners of the shacks couldn't really object because, of course, they own the shack, but not the land under it. So they weren't an improved property. And then the whole question of their historical significance came up, and they were listed in the National Register by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. So then the Park Service had to shift gears and say, this is an ongoing tradition and we need to maintain it. And so they've done that through partnerships, leaseback arrangements, all sorts of different agreements that allow the shacks to continue to be used by artists as a source of inspiration, as a retreat, et cetera. And that's just one of it does get complicated. I will say that there's so many issues like that. They're about preservation and recreation. They're about, are we actually maintaining the way of life, and what is that anyway? Are we preserving the character of the Outer Cape? Well, what do you mean by the character of the Outer Cape? For people in Provincetown, those dune shacks were sure part of the character of the Outer Cape. They were sure part of the way of life, and the Park Service had to learn to adapt again, and say, okay, if that's what the character is, if that's what the way of life is, we need to have management policies that make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think towards the end of the book, you really ask that directly, and in terms of what is the way of life? Did it survive the first 50 years of the park's existence in any meaningful sense? And it really got me thinking about measuring success and how we measure success here specifically. In your mind, to what extent was the National Seashore designation and all of the efforts that followed it successful? I mean, do you feel like they really did the best job they could here, and had to sort of make everybody happy, and were they able to do that in a way that ultimately balanced that tension between preservation and recreation and everything else?
Well, I'm an optimist and I believe in parks. So,
Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to say yes. But it's also important to recognize this was an experiment in 1961. They were writing legislation unlike any previous park legislation, and they acknowledged as much. Kennedy wrote a letter saying, we're going into uncharted territory here. And so as an experiment, you shouldn't expect it to all work out perfectly.
Sure.
It also became a model. That's why we call it the Cape Cod model for subsequent new parks. And a lot of them had more problems than Cape Cod, interestingly, along the same lines as far as the conflicts go, but they were more heated, more difficult, because the Cape Cod really wasn't a model. It was just adapting to the circumstances of Cape Cod. And when people didn't do that, but just simply took Cape Cod legislation as a model, rather than really adapting to the local circumstances, it created problems. As I said in the book, it's not really a model in the sense that it isn't intended to be a model for anything. The model is to be flexible, and so not to be a model. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a little, it's sort of a contradiction. But overall, when you look at how successful it's been, I really think you have to consider what the Outer Cape would have been if they hadn't done it. And there would be so many moments of the Outer Cape, being on the Great Beach, including in the fall or winter or in bad weather when there's nobody there. All of the historic houses, architecture, the Penniman House, the Atwood Higgins House, that wouldn't be there. All of the moments, in special, beautiful landscapes that are part of the seashore, like being out on Fort Hill, those are moments that just wouldn't be there. And a lot of the challenges that the Park Service faced had to do with the general changes in American society during this period. I mean, Barnstable County, which is what Cape Cod is as a county, was the fastest growing county in the state through a lot of this period. It went from being a relatively rural county to being a truly suburban and fairly upscale county. The types of people who were living there went from being mostly seasonal to really being mostly year-round. So a lot of houses are being converted and enlarged for year-round residents. The overall population trended to older, a lot of retirees, and et cetera. So these are national trends, and trends especially in Barnstable County. So you have to see it in that larger context, and ask the question, well, what would have happened if there were no seashore? Not just did the seashore achieve everything that 1961 legislation set out to do. The 1961 legislation set out impossible ideals. Preserve the Outer Cape in its present condition. Well, good luck with that. Besides erosion and besides all the social changes in Barnstable County, no landscape gets preserved in its present condition. That's not really a possibility. It's a living process. It's not just an artifact. It also set out to preserve the unique way of life of the Outer Cape. Well, no, legislation can't do that.
Yeah, you
We
can't freeze
really can't tell
everybody.
people how to live.
Yeah.
Sorry, you have to be a fisherman. You can't be an artist. We're preserving the way of life here. So there were some impossible ideals that were laid out, but they were ideals, and the legislation and the appropriations were made, and the Park Service administered it as best they could, often by hewing a middle ground in conflicts, compromises that were legally defensible. And so, yes, I'm an optimist, and I'll say that they've done a pretty good job, and that if the National Seashore had never been created, and this goes for a lot of other places, national seashores, national recreation areas that followed Cape Cod, we would be all the poorer for it. These are places that quite possibly express some of the highest aspirations we have in American society for the kind of society we would like to be. So I think it's important to understand their history and to really think about what it means for their future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's one thing that really impressed me about the book is, a lot of times you can walk into a beach or a park and see some of the people working there, see the visitor center and say, oh, like this is a quaint little thing. They just, built a thing and they have some people walking around managing it and da da da. And without a comprehensive history like this, it's really hard to realize that these are all enormous achievements. Like there were so many people involved for so long pushing to make this happen, whether it was individual private citizens, government workers, legislators, everybody came together. There was fighting and arguing and lawsuits and this epic battle to create this thing. And now people can just sort of show up. And it's sometimes, I think, can be difficult for people to realize everything that goes in there and to realize how much effort went into all of this. And so I think
that's why the Park Service wants histories of their parks.
Yeah.
Because in some place like the National Seashore, it's really easy for visitors or residents even to think of the seashore. Oh, those are the people who give us speeding tickets. Those are the people who tell us we can't go to the beach, we can't drive on the beach, or those are the people who tell us this or that. Why are they here anyway? Couldn't we do just as well without them? And if that's all people are thinking about in terms of a national seashore, they're not going to be the kind of partners in its future management they need to be. The seashore was created because you have this amazing generation of people in the mid 20th century, elected officials, town officials, the residents, the people of the Outer Cape, who came together despite the fact they had very different visions for the future, and agreed on at least some kind of blueprint for how to change the future of that landscape, how to improve the future of that landscape. It was a real collaboration, and it was unique in many ways to the population of the Outer Cape and of Cape Cod and the elected officials of the time. But the future of the park totally depends on that kind of collaboration, that kind of public spirit continuing. And so, yes, that was, to tell you the truth, the hidden motivation behind all of this is to encourage, not so hidden, is to encourage, the current generation of Cape Cod residents and visitors and Park Service employees to understand, the value of collaboration and this shared vision that indeed there is something that we can call the character of the Outer Cape. There is something that we can call the way of life. And no, we can't probably ever completely define it through legislation or any other way, but there's common value is what we can observe. And that needs to be the basis for how park management planning is done. It also needs to be the basis for how the towns are implementing their own land use regulations, which are what affect the inholdings as well as all the areas adjacent to the park. There needs to be a common vision of the value of what it is everyone's trying to achieve. And I do believe that having some comprehensive history of the place does help with that. I don't know how many people are going to be able to read it all, but I think they may, even if they're reading part of it, may start to get that picture. Wait a minute, there's something that very big here that happened, and we're part of that now, and that could really help people improve people's sort of, let's say, attitude toward the entire project, and maybe make them less angry when they get a speeding ticket. Maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah. Speeding tickets are always annoying, but Yeah, hopefully a little less angry. Well, I think the book really did that, and it was a pleasure to read for me. Uh, now that you've finished this epic, comprehensive history, and I know you've written a lot of other books, where are you focused right now? What are you going to be promoting the book, and what else are you up to after that's all done with?
Well, no, I'm moving on to another project in Boston, which
Hmm.
involves the Olmsted Park system in Boston. Franklin Park, which is the large park, the Central Park, if you like, or the Prospect Park of Boston, is receiving a new master plan from the city of Boston. And so I'm working on that with landscape architects and others, and writing a book about the history of Franklin Park for many of the same reasons.
Hmm.
I think if people, Franklin Park has not achieved its potential, let's say. That's what you say when you're. I didn't mean that to sound that bad, but
Yeah, it's okay.
but hopefully Franklin Park has this,
Hmm.
really brilliant future, and I honestly believe that we need to understand Franklin Park more completely if we're going to have a master plan for it.
Cool. Well, let's wrap it up with just a couple quick thunder round questions, and then we will take off. You ready?
Sure.
All right. What is your favorite food and or drink?
uh, Mint julep, which I'm
Ooh.
anticipating not yet, but a little later in the day. A nice
Oh,
summer drink when properly prepared, not too sweet. Good Kentucky bourbon.
I like it. Okay, that's a great. I haven't had one in a while. Good call.
You're gonna have
Uh,
one too. Eh?
I
I
should. I
told you.
should. Yeah, you did. Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Like real or imaginary?
Ooh, however you'd want to answer that.
Well, the psychologists refer to our happy place,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and I think it's pretty imaginary, unfortunately.
Fair.
Um, it's a good question, and I think there's a lot of different ways to answer that. But I think my happy place somehow involves a really nice apartment somewhere in the Upper West Side, Central Park West, overlooking Central Park. But it's not real, and it never will be.
Oh, oh, it's funny. I actually, or not funny, but I have a friend that has that exact spot. She has an Upper West Side condo, and it's looking over the park. It's like it's right at the that street, and you can see deep into the
What's her
park.
name?
Her name's
Never phone
Karen.
number? No.
Yeah, it's a
No, no, I
great
should,
great
as a national
place.
park historian, be prepared with a better answer.
Yeah,
Yosemite at dawn.
Yosemite.
No,
Right.
I'm a New Yorker.
Good. That's okay. You stick to that. And then last question: if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
What do you mean? Any one thing? Can I
You could.
relate it to our topic at least? That's a
You
little
sure?
broad.
I know it is. You can relate it. Sure.
I mean, I could, right. I would like people to remember what American parks are about because I think
Mm.
that's remembering what unifies us, if I can say that. And it's remembering the aspirations for the good things about this country. And I realize there are a lot of bad things about this country, and its history. I'm a historian. I'm not blind to American history and the atrocities that it has entailed. But I think when I'm writing about national parks or about parks in general, it's with the hope that we can also remember what brings us together, what our common aspirations have been that have been laudable. And I think when we do that, public places in general, but especially public parks, take on greater significance, and we take better care of them. It's about
Mm.
public life. It's about a public identity and spirit. That's what gets expressed or not when you have public places. And since I care about those places, what I'm really caring about, of course, is something much larger.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I think we're going to end on that awesome note. Thanks again, Ethan Carr, author of The Greatest Beach, A History of Cape Cod National Seashore. The book is great. I highly, highly recommend it. And yeah, thanks again for being on the program, Ethan.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.